So we are a social innovation partnership steered by the principal scientific advisor to the government of India. And we are trying to raise scientific awareness and get more insight into uh, India's human and environmental ecosystems. At the same time, we also try to increase engagement and participation in it. So, on the eve of World Environment Day, we decided to spread awareness about some of the tiniest hands that put food on our table, that is, pollinators, a very important member of our ecosystem. So, without much ado, let me introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Soubadra Devy from ATREE, Bangalore. She is a senior fellow at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. She's an interdisciplinary ecologist with research in pollination, especially in human dominated landscapes. Her research spans across pollination in wild and cultivated plants. She has worked in and works in protected areas as well as human dominated landscapes in two of India's biodiversity hotspots, the Western Ghats and the Eastern Himalayas. She combines ecology with interdisciplinary work to understand how human dominated systems, such as pastoral lands and cityscapes, can be both sustainable, that is, they promote biodiversity, while at the same time provide livelihood and ecosystem services. So, with that, thank you, ma'am, and please tell us more about pollinators.
Oh, thank you for the nice introduction. Well, it's indeed a pleasure to be on the World Environment Day. It's tomorrow, though, particularly talking about the little things that run the world. I should really, I'm very thankful for Eco Network for having invited me, and also B. Gagana and Shannon, who's been, has been felt that pollination is very important, particularly on the World Environment Day. We are almost on the cusp of a weekend, having zoomed out over the week. I think everybody is kind of eager to get into our gardens and do some nice gardening. Well, I will sort of now share my screen and get into the directly into my talk. I hope I'm audible. Well, when we started working, people were either working on tigers and elephants and bigger things. I don't know, I felt that the little things should also need attention. That's how I started with butterflies. And slowly I thought it should be a little more functional. And that's how I sort of got into pollination. And I also felt it's a very critical service because food depends on that. That's how I sort of got into pollination ecology. I started with natural systems, working in the canopy of Western Ghats, the pollination of tall trees. So that's where I am. I started with as I told you, with natural system, and slowly moved on to the human-dominated landscape and even crops.
Ma'am, yeah, after having worked in the Western Ghats, is it less exciting or more exciting to work in human-dominated landscapes? Because the Western Ghats are beautiful.
Well, I know. I mean, of course, the natural system has its own. It's exciting, of course. It's also a lot of fun. But I think if you really want to get a little more applied, I think we have to work in human-dominated landscapes, and I don't think there's an escape from that. And it has its own, importance, and that's equally exciting, I would say, because it's more about solutions. There is, of course, unraveling a lot of evolutionary ecology. It was equally a fascinating field. I think both are important and both are equally exciting. Yeah.
So I have personally had the privilege to hear some of your work before. Like I was lucky to sit in one of your talks, and I know that you have worked with a lot of people who work with very difficult. I mean, I think they're difficult because they sting quite a lot. Difficult kind of bees. So, do you think that there's a difference between how people in the rural setting or tribal setting interact with pollinators compared to like city dwellers?
Yeah, I mean, I went with the impression that a lot of people would understand pollinators when I went to the rural landscape because they are more hands-on.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, very few people connected with pollinators. In fact, they are not aware of this thing because it's a lot more insidious and it happens behind the scene, right?
Hmm.
I must have just heard one person with whom I interacted, an old lady, say that for the okras to come in good numbers, you should have a bee dancing before the flower. So when these are very rare, oftentimes
Hmm.
people don't relate that good fruit set, you need pollinators. I'm sorry about this technical glitch. When we did our trials, it worked out very well. I don't know what really happened. Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about bringing back edible gardening culture in urban scapes, and pollinators are the key, is what I'm trying to emphasize today. Next slide, please. Yeah, so before we start, we should a little bit about this person because he's known as the father of terrace gardening in India. I like this statement. He said every family had a kitchen garden back then, and most of the food was from the garden, and except a few things like rice, pulse, and few vegetables were the only ones they got from markets and other places. We all know things have changed so much. The next slide. Yeah. But people are getting back to growing their own food in a different way. But it is more bouncing back as what you call as locovary. People are becoming health conscious and like to have more locally grown food because it has all the nutrients intact. Earlier, we would find, as Vishwanath said, we would find most of it, or the vegetables we want, we'll pick once a week in the Sante or the village market. Of course, now things are changed. We are moving to more supermarkets where how the fruits look also matters. Sometimes I really wonder if the apples are also out of the factory. Just on the left side, you see the watermelon, which is almost a cube. This is by the Japanese. So it's also become about looks. We never, I think many years back, we never bothered how our fruits or vegetables looked. So it has become very, very important now. It's become almost manicured. The next slide. Yeah, but what are the gains of locavore? Access to locally grown food, of course, and also reduction in the carbon footprint. I should realize that some of our fruits we pick from the supermarket, like say the dragon fruit, comes from really, really far away. And if you really go and see the map of how the food travels, it's really, and connected with the carbon footprint, it's really mind-boggling. So it's a lot of carbon footprint. Some of our food leaves a big carbon footprint. So it becomes very important to be conscious about that. And we also know the time between the food, where the food is grown and reaches the plate, is also long, and it minimizes the nutrients. So we were used to seasonally grown fruits like mangoes. We would connect or connect summer with mangoes, right? But now we do get mangoes throughout the year because we deep freeze it and also ripen it by artificial means. In the process, we lose many of the beneficial phytochemicals in the diet. So next slide. Yeah. So what are the key components of home gardening? We all know this. Manure. Of course, we all do this. And I think the Bangaloreans are smart. They also use your daily kitchen waste into the daily dumps and make manure. People get excited having soldier fly do the process and get upset if the soldier fly is absent in the thing. So that much consciousness is there. But we also add sheep poo and other kind of cow dung and other things to it. So people are good at this and they're conscious that they should have manure is important. This next slide. Yeah, we also react when we see a lot of our plants being eaten. we get very upset, and we sort of, we try all kinds of things. We swat. We even use pesticides, chemical pesticides, because we don't like many of our flowers and fruits being eaten. Coming the next slide, the third, which is an important ingredient, is somewhat neglected. If you look at it, just to explain this, all of us have read about pollination right from our school days, right? It is about moving the pollen from the anthers to the style is an important step. And then you sort of, the ovary gets fertilized and you develop a fruit or vegetable. And the carrier of this pollen is generally a bat, bird, but largely what comprises pollinators is a suite of insects, little tiny crawly, creepy things. They are the most important part, comprising about 90% of pollinators. The vertebrate pollinators is just a small percentage. And the whole process, because it happens behind the scenes, often people don't give value. They think the fruits just appear when you have your ingredients and do your pest management, and forget that you should have pollinators. Next slide. Yeah. So again, I think, so we would just say 1 out of every 3 bites we take, we have to thank a butterfly, bat, bird, or other pollinators. So just because 90% of all the food we take is dependent on pollinators, and all the other flowering plants, or even your forest plants, about 90% are dependent on pollinators. Just imagine dropping the staple food like your wheat, rice, and your oats or whatever. Everything that you eat is dependent on pollinators. To emphasize that further, the next slide. Just imagine, without pollinators, you would not have all these exciting things on your plate. Even your morning coffee, you can't even get up and move without, many of us can't imagine moving without a cup of coffee. Your fruits and nuts, everything is dependent on pollinators. The next slide. Yeah, so the right side is a plate where you can have a diet without pollinators. It looks terribly insipid. And the one on the left is very colorful and exciting. So can we do without the screely croppies, and how do we bring them into the urban landscape? Next slide. Yeah, so I mean, it's just not about nutrients and your fruits and your health. It's also about, it has an economic cost. So just look at this woman on the left-hand side. It is China. It is an apple orchard. What has happened is there has been a big demand for fruit, apples, particularly the Chinese apples around the globe. So what happened, the farmers started intensifying their crop. They started expanding spatially, as well as even within their space intensifying. And what happened was it left a big pollinator deficit, and they couldn't have enough pollinators to meet the demand. So they really had to hire people to hand pollinate it. Just imagine how tedious it could, and the cost of labor investment. And coming down, it's not very far. I mean, India also it happens. Himachal again faces the same problem of apple orchards not setting fruit, and people are cutting down the trees. There's another example to say the vanilla. We imagine during COVID time, all of us were into baking. I think we popped the vanilla extract into almost all our baking stuff. We can't do our baking without vanilla. So this is in Kerala. What happened is this was an introduction without understanding the pollination biology. It's an orchid. It was introduced, and they didn't realize it needed a very specific pollinator, a Melipona bees, in its original habitat. The Madagascar, it was pretty common. So when we introduced, there was no food set, and slowly people started investing in hand pollination. Luckily, the flowers are quite large, so it was a lot more easier to, and fewer flowers, so it was a lot more easier to pollinate the apples as well as the vanilla flowers. Just imagine if you were to pollinate the mustard and other small oil seed plants, it's definitely is, we just simply cannot do it. So it's impossible, near to impossible. And right side is again, a little more understanding on the pollination biology is required. What happens if I showed you the flower pot, the parts of a flower, you have this ovary, right? The ovary has something called ovules. There needs to be certain amounts of pollen landing on the style to have it pollinated. That is, each plant has a certain pollen ovule ratio. So the pollen has to reach in a certain amount to have a full potential. So if it is receiving a fewer pollens than required, you will have a fruit which is totally distorted or something very small, not the full potential. It doesn't grow to the full size. So it's very important to understand the biology and the requirements, pollination ecology of some of the plants we grow. Next slide. Yeah, so here again, I'm going to take you to some of the unsustainable practices and the learnings from there. And it's creeping into India also. All of us must have heard about the great colony collapse disorder in the West, both in America and in Europe, which is where the almond and the apple fields are completely dependent on what you call as mobile pollinators, completely dependent on one species, which is Apis mellifera, or the Italian bees. The huge truckload or a truckload of them are carried by the beekeepers into these farms, and they are placed. And they sort of not only make honey, and they get some fee for this service. Everything went on well, but what happened was there was this disease, which they're still trying to figure out. It's viral and fungus and a combination. Suddenly, it was very rampant, and the entire almond industry crashed, and the loss was many $billion. That's when Europe and US woke up and felt it's so important not to be dependent on one single species or somewhat equivalent to monoculture. And they started realizing we need a lot of wilderness supporting and fostering wild bees flowing into the system. And for this is in Kodagu, where we have the coffee county of India, as we call it. It has started. This is a public sector movement where Khadi India has started this mobile apiary. So this is not a good sign, I would say. I mean, I think we are moving towards it, especially in Kodagu. There is an anecdotal evidence, like in early 1990s, there was this disease called the thigh sac brood disease, which attacked the Apis cerana, which is an important pollinator species of coffee. And it is the only species which is kind of domesticated for honey. So there was someone called Suresh who had this huge, he was the biggest private apiary owner, and he saw the crash of his honey, completely all the bees dying. But the coffee did not crash. So when we chatted with them, it became very evident that something else compensated. And he suggested it could be the Apis dorsata or the rock bee, which is sort of compensating for it. So even there, because the wild population was there, it was a savior. But unfortunately, in the same landscape, this is being promoted. The next slide. Yeah. So, I mean, coming back to our story, how do we get back edible gardening culture into our cities? Of course, with the full suite of pollinators, is it easy? There's a lot of, we had a online survey, and we came up with some very interesting results. Actually, we realized space was not a big constraint. This is a bird eye view of Bangalore. In summer, it might look absolutely impossible, but actual survey said there's a lot of spaces in the form of terrace, which can be looked as a last frontier of gardens, or the highest gardens. At the city scale, you have the parks, the ground, and the public-private properties, which has a ground space as well as terrace. And we can also start looking at apartment terraces as commons, right? And all the community could join and start vegetable or edible gardening. And of course, there is innovative way of having these edible gardens in your balconies with these wheels which you can move up and down, capturing the sunlight. And of course, placing it in such a way that you sort of invite the pollinators. Next slide. Yeah. So, I mean, it's easily said than done. If you go, I mean, of course, urbanization is it's a dominant geographical trend, but each city has an identity, right? So if you look at, and also has a strong influence of social and cultural attributes. So if you look at this right side picture, the first one is Madurai, which is a temple town. It has a character, right? Each city has a character. And below is Pondicherry, which has a very colonial kind of a character, and then of course our Bangalore. So each one, and these identities can change with time. Just to demonstrate with Bangalore, the next slide. Yeah, so Bangalore once was a pensioners' paradise, looked at as a pensioners' paradise, and people envied because of the its salubrious weather, right? People always said, "Oh, you guys have good weather." It's the common thing. Of course, they don't realize we also struggle with the traffic and the pollution. Yeah, but in early 90s, it was also a very laid back lifestyle. And gardening was a pastime. And people, as Vishwanath said, people grew their own vegetables. But we know that change, it has now kind of moved to more IT city or IT city, right? And you have a different kind of people, a mixture of people from diverse cultures. And a lot of young people have come in. So these are people who also do a lot of globe trotting, and they are used to certain kind of landscapes, very temperate and very Western kind of landscapes. And you also see the sprawl alongside the sprawl. The city sprawl is also increasing over time. So there's a lot of change. No city is static. It just changes its character. And I think in case of Bangalore, the transition has been pretty fast. The next slide. Yeah, so well, if you go back in history a little bit, if you step back, this is in the 18th century. What were the commons? The commons were this arilcates, or the cement or whatever platform with a huge banyan tree, a banyan or a peepal tree, which had a lot of fruits and attracted a lot of birds. And you also had this ficus dependent on a single species of wasps. And yeah, so the royals established this commons. We have always heard about the mango trees of Tipu Sultan in Lal Bagh. And of course, over time, with British coming in, they added the Cubbon Park. So the next slide. So inadvertently, they had, or by intent, they had combined recreations with edible fruits. It's not only this arilcates, they had some gund thopes, which was again in the midst of your, the rice fields or your ragi fields, you had this mango groves or any groves. So they had combined a social space with edible landscaping. The next slide. Yeah, but with British introduced what you call as park culture for recreation, and it has only grown with time, right? Even we get very upset when the walkway around the lake is closed. So we have sort of moved to this culture now for recreation. It is greenery, but it may not be a greenery which supports pollinators or any other biodiversity. Next slide. Yeah, but way back, somehow people adopted both the culture, the park culture, as well as the home garden utilitarian vegetable growing habits. In front, they would have the very flowering and very showy flowering horticulture plants, and at the back, they would sort of maintain what I might call a haphazard vegetable or fruit garden. At cityscape, what has happened, the same salubrious weather was conducive for expansion of the parkscapes. And the natural thorny vegetation became a little rare. We still have a small speck in maybe in GKVK now. So, we've been humanizing this landscape. And I think for the Britishers, it was like bringing back a bit of Scotland here where they are far away from home. Yeah, so the next slide. Yeah. So what is happening with the parks? Just to see the left side, everybody knows about permaculture and Fukuoka, the very famous Japanese man. He always advocated what you call as tiered farming, where you have shrubs, the trees, and your creepers. This is a very small space where he sort of supported. He had diverse food growing plants. And here, and also high biodiversity value. If you look at the parks, it has high in aesthetics, but low biodiversity value. So this is what has happened to Bangalore. We have a lot of neighborhood parks being established by our municipality, which looks somewhat like this. They have a certain combination, right? You have the Grevillea or the silverwort in the periphery, and you have a bit of lawn and those cannas and other typical plants in the center. Every neighborhood parks looks alike. Next slide. Yeah, it's not just about the space and what is happening at the city scale, and also at a different scale. There's been a disconnect, huge disconnect, and there is a biophobia that is increasing among urban folks. How many of our kids go and have the opportunity to pluck a tomato like this? Most of them pick stuff from the supermarket, right? And they are scared of even any small. This is a little on the extreme, but even a termite, they're scared of termite, which is very docile. They're very scared of termites, etc. Because we are used to a very sterilized kind of a habitat or surroundings around us now. Earlier on, if we buy, say a rice and stored it, after a while, we would have some weevils. Our grandmoms used to sort of remove a few of those weevils, and still we would use it. Now, because of food preservatives, we don't see a single. The Sona Masuri we pick up from the supermarkets hardly has any weevils and stuff. So it's, how much of sterilization happens, how much of pesticides happen. So we have become so intolerant and developed a biophobia. The next slide. Yeah, so I like this Rosenberg's principle of reconciliation ecology, which could be applied to build biophilia. So how do we do this? He talks about building biodiversity, which includes even the pollinators around us, the places where we work, play, everything. So he says it should be in our immediate vicinity. It shouldn't be just this the sanctuaries where the wildlife sit. It's also about putting very ordinary nature back. For instance, it's not about having rare species or exotic species. It's about maintaining what is existing and also create new habitats. It needn't be absolutely wild. So I think perhaps this principle will help us build the biophilia back. Next slide. Yeah. So we went on to check the level of biophilia in Bangaloreans. This is a study by Savita Swami, and she looked at the neighborhood parks I was talking about around Bangalore, complete Bangalore. She did a survey, and she went to see what people like and what people don't like among the fauna and flora. So this is what she found. Of course, butterflies were very popular, birds were very popular, dragonflies, and they went up to ants. And of course, snakes, I understand, although the lizard and snails are docile, still there seems to be an aversion. So we all know that the most of the snakes are not poisonous, but we need to recognize them and connect with the snake rescuers. But again, that needs to build the biophilia and understanding the ecology a bit and understanding to identify them. Learning to identify them. So it needs a long way to go. It cannot. We are, some of us who are here already converted people, but it has to really happen at a larger scale. The next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm also talking about so what's happening to our cities, happening to the cities and its pollinators. How does Bangalore fare? So this is a study. So we had a transect running from the city to through peri-urban area to the rural area. It was the North Transect in the North Bangalore, and this is what we found. Just opposite to what one would expect, right? In the rural area, what we saw was largely the social bees and honeybees, which is your Dorsata, Apis dorsata, Serrana, and Floria, and many of the solitary bees were missing. In the peri-urban area, you had a combination of both. It was a transition area, and then you moved to the urban area. You really had a lot of diversity. So why is this? What we speculate was, and also our floral composition survey showed that what is happening in the rural area is largely monoculture, right? You can have your Avrekalu, but it is a monoculture. We didn't have the diversity. And we also had high pesticide use. So that could be affecting many of the species. Whereas your social bees are more gregarious, so you tend to see them more. What is happening in the urban area is people are growing all kinds of flowers and not fruits, all kinds of flowers. Even your horticulture varieties seem to attract a lot of diversity. So there is a lot of resources. There is a diversity, but there is not enough numbers of each of the species. So when I think so, we are good. Bangalore is good, I would say. The next slide. Yeah, so that was by Chetana, Jagdish, and Sunil. Another study is by Ronita Mukherjee. This is a tale of squash in Unikal. We all know squash is a very popular sambar vegetable in all our darshanis in Bangalore. Whoever goes and sort of scoops the sambar is definitely likely to see this vegetable. So where is it grown? Largely in Unikal, which is looked as a vegetable hub of Bangalore. So Ronita, what she did was, it was interesting. So she looked at this one vegetable and its response in terms of pollinators to urbanization. So Earth transect with the fields ran from absolute urbanized area, which is the electronic city, to somewhat a relatively less urbanized area to one which is farms, which is abetting the green space, which is the Bannerghatta National Park. So what did she find out? The next slides. These are grown as creepers or trailed over the props. So this is the vegetable. So again, as I said, we need to understand its pollination biology a bit. It is a species which is monoecious. What does monoecious mean? It has the male and female flower separate, the male flower and female flower, as you see here, found in the same plant, but still it needs pollinators to move the pollen. So what she found was, the next slide. Yeah, so interesting. She was quite upset first because the year she went out to do a study was a drought year, but it turned out to be an opportunity later. So what happened was, we all know we expect because of climate change, climate extremes, right? Either it's going to be heavily raining or 1 year, and it could be a drought year. So during the normal year, when the rainfall was normal, what she found was in a farmland, there were bees. The bee assemblage on the plants were sort of represented largely by the trigonas. Trigonas are the stingless bees, which does not have a big foraging range, and they came from the immediate surrounds. And she encountered other bees, which were other dorsata, but they were quite rare. And as you moved, we didn't see so much of dorsata in the agriculture landscape or production landscape that year. So we speculate that they are mostly sort of lingering in the wilderness, which is the the Bannerghatta National Park. So what happened in the drought year was completely different. Your trigonas were absent, and what was happening is we were encountering more and more of Apis dorsata, or your rock bees. So what's happening is these bees, which were perhaps active in the Bannerghatta National Park, because of the drought, even the wild plants respond to drought. So there must have been less resource and started foraging outside into the landscape. And what was happening was, although the floral output was low, the number of flowers the plant put out was low, actually the fruit set was, the pollinator visits was sufficient to sort of give the service of pollination. So there was a compensation by this dorsata. So this is enabled because we have this diversity and wilderness to sort of compensate during abnormal years or during drought. So there is a lesson. This is a take-home lesson. So we need a lot of what you call as something to substitute or backup mechanism in our system, build up a backup mechanism, and we can't go the monoculture way. The next slide. Yeah, so I think when we sort of combine, I'm very hopeful when we sort of combine food, when we say, oh, let's grow food, maybe we can build a biophilia. So, they might be a little tolerant to occasional stings. So it can happen at all scales, at a very small scale. It can happen in your office space, in the window boxes of your houses. And it could be growing your microgreens with a little bit of aquarium on your study table. We can make it you can build biophilia. I'm very sure, but it needs a strong outreach and capacity building. The next slide. Yeah, I'm going to say people will, as I told you, the space is not a constraint. I'm going to give you this example. This is a 3 into 3 meter garden. It is an experiment garden, sort of experimentation and a model built by Ganesan, my colleague. And this is, you have the buns. You also have buns running across, and you have a small pit. So what you do is you grow your okras and brinjals on the buns, and your shallow area with all your greens and your spinach, and the buns outer area is your manure plants like your gliricidia, which is a manure plant, and you sort of trim them accordingly because you also need sunlight coming in. Accordingly, you trim them and sort of dump them in this pit, and you pour water. What happens is that you don't have to manure them often because there is a seepage of nutrients to all this around this place. And the right, another click, please. Just click. Now, next slide. Yeah. So what happens is this is what you look. You may not have a very fancy salad bowl out of these gardens, but definitely it would sort of feed a family, a small family with an Indian meal. The next slide. Yeah, so you can even try unconventional methods. In your terrace garden, what happens is you waterproof it. After a while, your soil gets compacted. So what you do is you do a layering of the usual the muck and soil, mud and grit, and then you sort of have this Coca-Cola cans or anything. I'm not saying only any cans. And you sort of throw a muck over that, another layer of muck, and grow. Because of aeration, your plants do better. So this is no-till gardening, so which is also another effective way. I think you can get creative and space, and there are ways to sort of do urban gardening, edible landscaping. The next slide. Yeah. So while you do the gardening and get carried away, we should be also think about water. And water is a premium or very pricey, particularly in the Bangalore kind of setup. So, there are people who have come up with very creative ways of combining the gray water hydroponics with home gardening. Here you say the spinach on this thing, and they also sort of connect it to your pots. So it is definitely a win, win, and win, because you have the conservation gains, the health gains, as well as you're conserving. Your practice is more sustainable. The next slide. Yeah, so we all saw, and even in our online survey showed there was a surge of home gardening, in the terrace gardening during the lockdown, the earlier lockdown. But then after people started working from home more intensively, I think there was a dip. That's mainly because people get busy, but no problem. There are startups that have also started mushrooming who sort of set up and also do this maintenance on equal intervals. They come and also maintain your garden. So, you at least you're sort of giving your space. This is a story about a startup in Jaipur. They had established about 300 gardens in the city, and they're talking about a huge tons of harvest. It is doable even at a city scale, is what I'm saying. So we meet that requirement within the city. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So yes, there has been efforts. Most of these efforts have been sporadic. It still is a niche. Sometimes very short-sighted too. As I told you, people don't do with so much of knowledge. So there's still a lot of capacity building that is required. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so how do we integrate pollinator at the city and at a household level? So if you have a grounded property and have a relatively bigger space, you could have a bee hotel like this with multiple spaces, multiple kind of holes and sizes, because each species have its own burrowing size, etc. It's not about the solitary bees alone. You also might have some wasps colonizing, the beneficiary wasps, and also wasps which might feed on the carpenter larvae, but that's a small natural ecosystem you're building. You don't have to worry about that. You still would have pollination service. And if you could have a nice small dangling one, like the one in the right side, or you could just have a bamboo place or any hollowed stick in your thing. Very quickly they'll be colonized, which we also realized in, I think Chetana had put a bamboo stick and immediately there was colonization. So this shows how much is a constraint for some of the space for homes, particularly the nest sites. And there was someone who also told that she laid so many of the sticks, and a generation one was over and she had the next generation come and colonize. So I think this is how you can integrate at an individual house level, but then you can also look at larger way to do it. Next, yeah. So if you have a big, if you think about, the buildings, the public and the private buildings, which has huge space, we could get a little high tech, but yeah, also keeping principles of sustainability. So you can have the solar panels, which would sort of, because we also need to have this water coming in. It'll be slightly larger scale, so you need some electricity involved, and you should also move some of your green, all your vegetable trays in a way that it captures sunlight. And also you should integrate you can integrate pollinator installation, which is little larger, and you should perhaps have, because it is elevated from the ground, you should have baits. Perhaps you could have, this is one model, you could have flowering plants, which is also edibles. Now a lot of edible flowers are coming into, many people have started eating flowers as edibles. So you should, so this acts as a bait to draw. So along with this, a lot of vertical gardens and others might make it like a very undulating, continuous garden for many of these pollinators. Yeah, the next slide. Yeah, so in cities, as I told, people are all the time worried about how good looking or whatever aesthetically pleasing is your garden, right? So we could think of interesting ways. We could have a cucurbit walkway. All this can be grown in Bangalore. So I'm just saying this could, or in any city for that matter. So it's about being creative and keep making it still look good. Next slide. Yeah. So most of the, what is vogue, even horticulture plants, what you see in 90s are not found in 2000. There's vogue even among horticulture plants. Now, the current thing is vertical gardens in Bangalore and many cities, I think. But then if you look, it's mostly the non-edibles. Even the apartments, your driveway has this these days. So now this could be combined with edibles and non-edibles to make it a little more, sustainable, right? Why waste water just for aesthetics? You could do a mix-up. This is another example. Next slide. Yeah. So this is another example of how terrace gardening can really, I look at it as the last gardening frontiers. This is an example of China. It's about 4,800 square meter, a textile mill. And so they just engage 3 gardeners and it kind of feeds the community kitchen. The community kitchen, I mean the employees' kitchen. So I think these are all happening closer, not very far away. I think closer home. So this is something we can adapt also. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So suppose say Elsita is the municipality in the electronic city, so which kind of decides to go adapt the terrace gardening in a big way, and say the Yalanka township is another place, and you have this little gardens in your balcony. Is it enough? as I told you, this bees, if you keep a a bee hotel, you're not keeping the bees captive, just feeding on your little garden. They forage, they need to forage, they need a diverse resources because they also collect their pollen and honey based on their energetics. It's a lot of evolutionary stuff in there. It's not like random. They also sort of, all the food is also very linked to the energetics. So we need to have everything connected. And while we do a little thing, there has to be a nudge towards public policy to sort of have to see a larger picture. How do we make the whole cityscape more edible? City greenscape more edible. It should be really, there should be a nudge towards a public policy also. So for instance, we sort of work with strong outreach and make ELCITA. We talk to all the electronic city people and say, oh, you have to have it, and suppose convince, and also the Elanka, but still there is a gap. So we could set models, but we need a nudge from public policy. But we have examples. For instance, you have the solar water heaters, right? Now we have to have it implemented in our buildings, until otherwise you will not get your electricity connection. So, I think there has been successful models. We'll move to the next slide. So how do we scale up? So first thing is to map. As I told you, the space does not seem to be constrained. Look at the landscape as a very undulating up and down kind of a thing. First, we have to sort of map it by the willingness, and also hand in hand, we should also have the policy support to have it going. The next slide. Yeah, so this is an example. So these were this is from Italy, small city in Italy, where you had 3 nests, green things, people this thing, and slowly they started connecting it with a lot of corridors. And look at the statistics, some of the statistics. The next slide. Yeah, so this is the rooftops, which is about the flat areas, about 82 hectares. And look at the kind of yields they're talking about. It's really huge. And what is very interesting is one statistic, 77 of the city needs have been met. So we seem to be putting a lot of pressure on our hinterland, which is the rural landscape. Most of the cultivation is nudged towards that. And when there is a price fall, I think the farmers are the losers most of the time. You see all the time the tomatoes being thrown in the roadside and stuff like that. So somewhere I think we should let the rural do its economic. We should have this linkage, but also have their own individual economics, and not have this complete dependence and the push factor from the cities. The next slide. Yeah. So I gave you examples. One example was the 2 cities there. There are more examples even from East. East, Shanghai, of course, stands out with a very mega. They have even enabled cereal supplies, which is surprising. But I think even in Bangalore, we have an example of people cultivating paddy on their terrace. But I think that's a bit going a little far. I don't know how sustainable that will be, but we have examples of roof garden. The biggest roof garden has come up in Paris, of course, and before that, in the East, you had Bangkok had the biggest terrace garden in the city. So I think if we have something, a flagship like that, like a project like that, I think the interest will go and the culture will sort of spread among many people who will start taking this up. Of course, integrating with pollinators, they shouldn't forget the third ingredient, the pollinators. Next slide. Yeah, so many studies have showed that also other the mental health benefits, also particularly reducing psychological disorders, particularly dementia. So during the lockdown, not only lockdown, many of these rooftop gardeners we found are also not the neo rooftop gardeners, generally the old people. I think it gives them, the older generation always finds it very difficult to cope with interact with the young generation or younger generations all the time. So it's always gives a scope for connecting the older generations, and it can really be an important social ecological space. And we all, I think it's also we close our door behind apartment and then never bother about the world outside. I think the terrace gardens are commons, treating the apartment terraces commons as more opportunities to socialize, which is becoming less and less. And people have also found communities which are more social are in fact able to avert crimes. And also we could have interesting things by seed exchange, where seed mix, so that you have a lot of genetic materials being this thing with diversity. You also avert many diseases, right? Your genetic diversity is like a shield, which sort of to cope with some unperceived sudden disease or something like that. And there's an opportunity for a lot of opportunity for co-learning. I'll leave with this slide. Yeah, a world without pollinators. Of course, we know who's in the right. But instead of saying 12 million bees, I would say 12 million pollinators, because there are other guys who have not received so much attention. I think the bees receive attention because people readily connect with honey, but it's just not social and honeybees. There's also other bees. And with this, I will show you a small clipping on how the bamboo could be just propping a bamboo in your balcony can bring a bee. Gagana, can you play that? Yeah. So.
So shall we open the floor up for questions now?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are a lot of questions, and first, that is in all of our minds. Is there a pollinator crisis brewing currently in India?
Well, I really can't say for sure, but there are, sporadic, evidences, anecdotal evidences here and there. For instance, in BRT, because of the land use change, they started growing a lot of pollinator attracting crops in the foothills. With a lot of pesticides, people have started seeing a lot lesser bees go up the hills, the hilltops. That's one. So there are evidences here and there. And so we really need a country level study, I would say, by multiple institutions to sort of assess. Of course, in a very intensive agriculture area, like as I told you, the apples in Himachal, they are saying, but that's also unsustainable practice, right? So we really don't know what's happening in other area. I mean, really need a country level study to actually say if there is a big crisis. Yeah.
Okay. So this is another question in the same vein.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a rural urban divide? Are rural agricultural areas suffering from lower numbers of pollinators?
Yeah, our study also showed that, yeah, there are, maybe because of the intense agriculture, it's largely monoculture. So, I mean, I don't know whether it is suffering from pollinators. One thing is, they don't grow so much. One thing is monoculture, and also a lot of pesticide use. There could be, they may not be having the full potential or full suite of pollinators, is my thing. And also, earlier on, the bunds used to have a lot of wild vegetation where all kinds of bees could sort of thrive. What is happening now is to increase your productivity. They go on and go, and you have barely a walking. You're able to walk on those bunds also. So the practice, yeah, I would say it might. So we really, as I said, we need studies which covers various agriculture practices and also various natural ecosystem to make an assessment.
Yeah. Now, this is a question from this person over here. They use hybrids in their kitchen garden. So the question is, do hybrids also need pollinators?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Hybrids.
Yeah. Hybrids may not need pollinators, but there are also studies says with some amount of pollination, they do increase fruit set, some of the seeds we buy. But I would say that it's against the principles of sustainability, right? We also, when we buy this hybrid seeds, we become dependent on this seed companies. So I would say it's also against seed sovereignty. So I, for instance, would always prefer an open pollinated seeds, as we call it, the farmer's seed. I think we should also bring in this culture of seed exchange and open pollinated seeds among our growers, because it also mixes a lot of genes, and you have the material to sort of fight in case a new pest arrive. They might have some resistance. So we need to have this genetical diversity.
Thank you. So are there any particular plants which can be grown in gardens to attract more pollinators?
Yeah, of course, you can have your just flowering plants which are attractive, but not the ones which goes on to make vegetables also. There's food for the pollinators. So which way you want to go matters. You could just give them food and not follow it up to the fruit set and harvest your vegetables or fruit. So there are two ways to it. And, you can just have this fancy lot of flowers. It would still attract your pollinators and give its food, but, it is not an edible gardening. So we could, but then, you could choose your gourds and other, you could also have your other, what you say, all your microgreens, which have very small flowers, which attracts very tiny pollinators, which you don't see it so easily. So I'm just saying, it's your choice. You could have just flowers which don't go on to make seed with your horticulture plants and just feed the bees, it may not be beneficial to you. So I think it two-way is much better. Yeah. The combination of cultivating a fruit or vegetable is much better.
Yeah. And ultimately that would serve both as an aesthetic, ecological, and economic purpose. So
yes.
Yeah. So I personally had a question. Like just listening to you right now, I identified some things that I had never thought about, like maybe bus stands, like the roof over our bus stops, and all these little spaces in and around like our city, which are not utilized and usually would collect rainwater. The gutters would collect rainwaters. Like if we start planting some of these edible greens there, could it help us in also controlling mosquito populations, for example? Would the pollinators compete with them in some way?
Mosquitoes are not, we do have bigger wild cousins of mosquitoes, some dipterans as pollinators, but definitely not the mosquitoes we see here. They're more sap feeders. Some of them are sap feeders. Yeah, and then your question about the rooftops and bus stand and your traffic islands is another stuff, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen that during some butterfly migration time. You see a lot of, in these islands, on the way, you see a lot of butterflies crash. So I'm not sure whether this butterfly islands and bus stops are good space. So, because they do have to, they can get hit by vehicles and stuff. So, that's why we really need a planning. It cannot be this isolated, sporadic efforts. We really need to plan these corridors and other stuff to sort of help the pollinators. It cannot be random, sporadic kind of efforts. So yeah, it has to be, the planning has to be at the city scale.
Understood. So in this scenario, what can a independent, enthusiastic person do?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm only talking about high volume traffic area, right? I think the apartment people have their balconies to experiment, where they can combine aesthetics as well as edible gardening, and the terrace is always there. It's very important, all the RWAs to come together and do this. They have gotten together to sort of link up during COVID to get their veggies and other things linking to the farmers through the app. So I think this practice also could be, it has the potential when the residential welfare communities come together. They could plan this also. And this, I think this will also nudge the government and other people to sort of come up with more policy which is suitable for edible landscaping and move towards urban agriculture.
Thank you, ma'am. There is just one more question, and then we can spare you to enjoy your weekend.
Okay.
So this is a question which asks if pollinators are limiting for fruit formations in gardens. I assume it is gardens in and around Bangalore. And what could be other factors that are at play?
Well, yeah, so people, pollinator is one. You just having the pollinators alone is not enough. No, I spoke about the 3 ingredients. It does need to have good nutrients. Otherwise, what happens is if it doesn't have the nutrients, it'll result in what you call as abortion of fruits. They sort of fall off young because they don't have the nutrients to sort of grow into bigger fruits. So nutrients is also important. And nutrients plus water is also very important factors. And some pest management is important. It's not like take the pesticide and completely finish. I think we can, some of this, what we perceive as pests might be a few insects which might be feeding on your leaves. So we should also learn to discern the pests from some of the, the ones which might be eating a few leaves and not do a blanket treatment. And when you sort of foster some of this wild vegetation, you also have predators of pests, which could help us. So, when having a little bit of, leaving set-asides, even within the within your, what do you call, your community space, say your apartment, they have this, all have the 10% of their area should be set aside for garden space. We can think of some area for leaving it little wild, so that it also sort of fosters other beneficial insect which could help in the predation of some of the pests. So nutrients and pest control are the other things we should keep in mind. Pest control in a way that is not very disastrous.
Everything in balance.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. This was really informative, and it was a very enjoyable way to learn more about what we can do about our city. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was fun doing this. Have a great weekend. Thank you. Thank you all.
You too.
Thanks for listening. Yeah. Bye.